The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, and Samuel Hartwell was grateful for it. Rain meant privacy. Rain meant the muddy roads would keep curious neighbors away from his land. Rain meant he could dig his own grave without witnesses, without explanations, without the burden of final words that nobody would want to hear anyway. At 42, Sam had the kind of face that told stories without permission, deep lines carved by Texas sun and deeper sorrows, premature gray threading through dark hair like silver wire marking time's passage, and eyes that had seen too much betrayal, mostly his own. The relentless downpour plastered his worn cotton shirt to his lean frame as he worked, methodical and determined, in the shadow of the massive oak tree, where he'd once carved initials that weather had long since claimed. Each shovelful of mud felt heavier than the last, weighted not just with Texas clay but with 20 years of accumulated guilt. The hole was nearly deep enough now, 6 feet down, just like the preacher always said. Deep enough to hold a man's body, deep enough to hold his sins, deep enough to finally end the daily torment of remembering what he'd done to 10 good women who deserved infinitely better than his cowardice. This wasn't how Samuel Hartwell's story was supposed to end. 20 years ago, he'd been the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties, heir to a cattle ranch that stretched from the Brazos River to the hill country beyond. He'd had prospects, charm, and a smile that could convince a banker to lend money without collateral. More importantly, he'd had love, not just one love, but 10 of them, each as pure and devoted as morning prayer. The shovel struck something solid. Sam paused, rain streaming down his face, and looked down at the wooden cigar box he'd buried here 15 years ago. His hands trembled as he recognized the familiar mahogany surface, now dark with moisture and time. Inside that box were 10 letters, wedding invitations he'd never answered, each one representing a woman he'd left standing at an altar in a borrowed white dress, waiting for a groom who'd lost his nerve and disappeared into the night like smoke. He'd been the worst kind of coward, not the kind who ran from gunfights or cattle rustlers. Sam had never backed down from physical danger. He'd been the kind who ran from emotional responsibility, from the weight of choosing one heart over 9 others, from the terrifying prospect of disappointing anyone who'd trusted him with their future. The memories flooded back with the force of a flash flood. Margaret O'Brien, the banker's daughter with laugh like church bells and eyes like spring sky. He'd proposed to her on a Sunday after services, kneeling in the churchyard while her father watched approvingly from the rectory steps. But then there was Catherine Mills, the rancher's daughter, who could ride better than most men, and whose green eyes held depths he'd never finished exploring, and Elizabeth Chen, whose family had come west from California, bringing recipes and traditions that made the whole town feel more worldly, more connected to something larger than their small corner of Texas. Each proposal had felt right in the moment. Each woman had brought out different parts of his soul. Margaret's gentle influence made him want to be respectable. Catherine's fierce independence challenged him to be stronger. Elizabeth's quiet wisdom helped him think beyond himself. But as the wedding dates approached, as the reality of choosing settled into his bones like arthritis, Sam had realized the impossible truth. He loved them all, and he couldn't bear to hurt 9 of them by choosing one, so he'd hurt all 10 instead. The rain grew heavier, turning the world into a gray wash of regret. Sam's calloused hands shook as he pulled the cigar box from the muddy grave, its contents representing the only real love he'd ever known. 20 years of isolation had taught him that running from love didn't make it disappear, it just made it fester, like an untreated wound that never quite heals. He thought about the other women too. Sarah Mackenzie, who'd inherited her father's horse ranch and run it better than he ever had. Mary Fitzgerald, the Irish immigrant's daughter, whose accent made even ordinary words sound like poetry. Rebecca Stern, whose family owned the general store and who could calculate profit margins faster than most men could count cattle. Anna Kowalski, the schoolteacher whose patience with difficult children had made Sam think she might have patience with difficult men too. Then there was Helen Morrison, the preacher's daughter who'd somehow seen past his Sunday-only righteousness to the man struggling underneath. Victoria Brennan, who'd inherited the largest cattle operation in the county and proved that women could run businesses as well as any man. And Grace Williams, barely 18 when he'd proposed, full of dreams and trust that he'd crushed like wildflowers under a careless boot. 10 women, 10 promises, 10 wedding dresses that had hung in wardrobes for weeks, growing more expensive with each passing day as families prepared for celebrations that would never come. 10 fathers who'd shaken his hand and welcomed him into their families. 10 mothers who'd planned reception meals and worried about wedding day weather, all of them betrayed because Samuel Hartwell couldn't find the courage to choose. The sound of approaching footsteps made him freeze. Impossible. His nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and nobody traveled these muddy roads in weather like this. Sam looked up from the grave he'd been digging, rain streaming down his face, and felt his heart stop entirely. 10 figures emerged from the storm like visions made manifest, all women, all dressed in white that should have been impossible to keep clean in this weather. Wedding dresses that moved in the wind like accusations given form, like promises returning to demand answers. They moved in perfect silence, forming a circle around the grave, around Sam, around the life he'd tried so hard to escape. The rain seemed to part around them, or perhaps it was just his imagination, but their white dresses remained pristine while he stood covered in mud and shame. He knew their faces. Even after 20 years, even through the veil of rain and his own disbelief, he recognized every single one of them. Margaret stood directly in front of him, her dark hair crowned with flowers that should have wilted in the storm. Catherine was to his left, those unforgettable green eyes reflecting lightning that split the sky. Elizabeth, Sarah, Mary, Rebecca, Anna, Helen, Victoria, and Grace, all of them. Every woman he'd promised to marry, every heart he'd broken, every dream he'd abandoned. They didn't speak. They just watched him with expressions that ranged from sorrow to fury, from disappointment to something that might have been pity. Sam's legs gave out and he sank to his knees in the mud, the shovel falling from nerveless fingers. "This isn't real," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rain. "You can't be real." But Margaret stepped forward, water dripping from her wedding veil, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 20 years of unanswered questions. "We're as real as the promises you made, Samuel Hartwell, as real as the children we never had with you, as real as the love that died waiting for you to find courage." Chapter 2. The Weight of Broken Promises. The storm raged around them, but Sam could only stare at the woman who'd been his first love, his first proposal, his first real regret. Margaret O'Brien, now Margaret something else judging by the simple gold band on her finger, looked exactly as he remembered her, yet completely transformed. The soft roundness of youth had been replaced by the sharp angles of a woman who'd learned to depend on herself. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'm so sorry." Catherine laughed, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter sound of dreams dying slowly. "Sorry? 20 years too late, and all you can say is sorry? Do you have any idea what you put us through?" "I was young," Sam said, desperation creeping into his voice like water through a cracked dam. "I was scared. I didn't know how to choose between you. I loved you all, and I thought, you thought it was easier to love none of us than to risk disappointing some of us," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice carrying the gentle firmness he remembered from their Sunday conversations after church. "You thought you could spare us all by sparing yourself the burden of choice." Sam looked around the circle of women, seeing not just their faces but their lives, the lives they'd lived without him, the strength they'd developed in his absence. Margaret's hands bore the calluses of someone who'd built her own success after he'd failed her. Catherine wore practical boots beneath her wedding dress, speaking of a woman who'd learned to rely on her own 2 feet. Elizabeth's posture spoke of confidence earned through hardship. You moved on," he said, surprised by the mixture of relief and bitter jealousy in his own voice. "We had to," Sarah said, her voice carrying the strength that had made her the finest horsewoman in the county. "But moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean we stopped wondering why we weren't enough for you to choose." "You were enough," Sam said, climbing to his feet despite the mud that seemed determined to drag him down to hell where he belonged. "You were all enough. More than enough. That was the problem." Mary stepped forward, her Irish accent still coloring her words after all these years. "Then why didn't you choose? Why did you run instead of staying to face the music?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sam had asked himself the same thing thousands of times over the years, and he'd never found an answer that made sense even to himself. How do you explain cowardice to people who'd never been cowards? How do you justify destroying 10 lives because you couldn't bear to disappoint 9? "Because I was afraid," he said finally, the words tumbling out like a confession at gunpoint. "Afraid of making the wrong choice. Afraid of hurting the ones I didn't pick. Afraid of not being good enough for any of you." Rebecca, whose family's general store had probably suffered when the scandal broke, touched the simple locket at her throat. "So instead of risking hurting some of us, you guaranteed you'd hurt all of us." "Yes," Sam admitted, the word feeling like a physical weight lifting from his shoulders. "I was a coward, and I ran, and I've spent every day since then regretting it." The rain continued to fall, but something had changed in the air around them. The raw anger in their faces hadn't disappeared, but it had been joined by something else. Understanding, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. Anna, who'd been the school teacher and probably understood human nature better than most, tilted her head slightly. "We all wondered what happened to you. And one day you were there making promises and talking about building a life together, and the next day you were gone like you'd never existed. I couldn't face you," Sam said, his voice barely carrying over the sound of rain on leaves. "Any of you. I'd made promises I couldn't keep, and I didn't know how to explain that to women who deserved better than explanations." Helen, the preacher's daughter who'd probably heard more confessions than most priests, studied him with eyes that had learned to see past surface sins to deeper truths. "Did you ever think about what we went through? The shame, the whispers, the way the whole town talked about us like we were foolish girls who'd been taken in by a smooth-talking con man?" Sam's stomach clenched with a new kind of pain. He'd thought about escape, about freedom, about the relief of not having to choose. He'd never considered what he'd left behind, not just broken hearts, but broken reputations, broken dreams, broken trust in love itself. "I thought about you," he said quietly, "every day, but I thought about my own guilt more than your pain." Victoria, who'd inherited her family's ranch and probably run it better than most men, laughed bitterly. "At least you're honest about your selfishness." "I deserve that," Sam said. "I deserve all of this. That's why I'm here. Why I was—" He gestured helplessly toward the grave he'd been digging, unable to finish the sentence. Grace, who'd been the youngest and probably suffered the most social damage from his betrayal, spoke for the first time. "You were going to take the coward's way out again." "Yes," Sam said simply. "I was." The circle of women closed slightly, and for a moment, Sam thought they might push him into the grave he'd prepared for himself. Instead, Margaret reached down and picked up the shovel he'd dropped. "Stand up, Samuel," she said, her voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there 20 years ago. "If you're going to die, you're going to do it on your feet, looking us in the eye." Sam stood, his legs shaking with exhaustion and a fear that went deeper than physical danger. These women surrounded him close enough that he could see the details of their faces, the ways that time and hardship had changed them, the strength that his betrayal had forced them to develop. "We came here tonight," Catherine said, rain dripping from her hair, "because we felt something calling us, a pull like a rope around our hearts dragging us back to this place, to you." "How did you know where to find me?" Sam asked, genuinely puzzled. "How did you even know I was still alive?" "The same way we knew you were in trouble," Elizabeth said softly. The same way we've always known when you were hurting, even after all these years. Love doesn't just disappear because you run from it. Sarah stepped closer, and Sam could smell the rain in her hair, the same wild scent he remembered from their rides across the prairie. Love doesn't just disappear, Samuel. It changes. It grows. It learns to forgive, but it doesn't disappear. Even after what I did to you? Sam asked, his voice breaking. Even after I humiliated you in front of everyone you knew? Especially after what you did to us, Mary said, her Irish accent making the words sound like a prayer. Because that's what love is. It's choosing to care about someone even when they don't deserve it. Especially when they don't deserve it. Sam felt tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. I don't understand. If you can forgive me, if there's still something between us, then why are you here? Why tonight? Chapter 3. The Sisterhood of Broken Dreams. Grace, who'd grown from a trusting girl into a woman of quiet strength, spoke for all of them. Because you were about to make the same mistake again, running away instead of facing the consequences of your choices. I can't undo what I did, Sam said, his voice raw with 20 years of suppressed grief. I can't give you back those years, those chances. I can't marry all of you, and I still can't choose just one. We know, Rebecca said gently, her voice carrying the patience of someone who'd learned to deal with difficult customers and unreasonable expectations. We've known that for 20 years. But there's something you never understood about us, Samuel. We didn't just love you, we loved each other. Sam blinked in confusion, rain streaming down his face. I don't understand. Anna smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from any of them. Warm, genuine, and tinged with something that might have been fondness. After you left, we found each other. We talked, we cried, we raged, and eventually we became friends. Sisters, really. Your betrayal brought us together in a way your love never could have. We helped each other heal, Helen added, her preacher's daughter wisdom shining through. We helped each other grow, helped each other find new kinds of love. Sam looked around the circle with new eyes, seeing for the first time the way they stood together, the way they supported each other, the way they'd come to him as a unified group rather than as individual women seeking individual revenge or reconciliation. I'm glad, he said, and meant it with a sincerity that surprised him. I'm glad you found each other. I'm glad you found happiness without me. But you didn't find happiness without us, Victoria pointed out, her rancher's directness cutting through sentiment to reach truth. You've been alone all these years carrying this guilt, letting it eat you alive like cancer. I deserve to be alone, Sam said. I deserve the guilt. I deserve to suffer for what I did to you. Maybe, Margaret said, considering his words with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to weigh consequences. But you don't deserve to die for it, and more importantly, we don't deserve to carry the weight of your death for the rest of our lives. Sam hadn't thought of that. If he'd gone through with his plan, if he'd ended his life in this muddy grave, these women would have carried that burden too. They would have wondered if they could have saved him, if they should have forgiven him sooner, if their love could have made a difference. I'm tired, he said, the words coming out broken and small. I'm so tired of carrying this guilt alone. Then don't, Catherine said, reaching out to take his muddy hand in her clean one. Don't carry it alone anymore. One by one, the other women reached out, creating a circle of connection that enclosed Sam in warmth despite the cold rain. He felt their strength, their forgiveness, their love. Not the romantic love he'd thrown away, but something deeper, something that had been forged in the fire of shared pain and mutual healing. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Now, Elizabeth said, you live. You find a way to make amends not just to us, but to yourself. You find a way to turn this guilt into something useful, something that helps instead of hurts. Sarah squeezed his hand. The county needs someone to help with the orphans from the Indian Wars, someone who understands what it's like to be lost and alone. The church needs someone to help with the poor families, Helen added. Someone who knows what it's like to carry shame. My ranch needs someone who understands hard work and harder truths, Victoria said. Someone who's learned the cost of running away. The school needs someone to help with the children who've been abandoned, Anna said. Someone who knows what it's like to abandon others. Sam looked around at the women who'd once been his brides-to-be and were now something more precious. His chance at redemption. They weren't offering him the life he'd thrown away. They were offering him a different life, one built on service and humility rather than pride and fear. I don't know if I can do it, he said honestly. I don't know if I'm strong enough to face the town, to face the shame, to face the work of becoming someone better. You won't be doing it alone, Margaret said, her voice carrying the promise of someone who'd learned the value of keeping her word. We'll be there, not as your wives, not as your lovers, but as your friends. As your family. Mary nodded, her Irish accent lending musical quality to her words. We've built something beautiful together, Samuel. Something that came from the ashes of what you destroyed. We want to share that with you. Why? Sam asked, the question tearing from his throat like a physical thing. After everything I put you through, after all the pain I caused, why would you help me? Grace answered for all of them, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned to find strength in forgiveness. Because that's what love does, Samuel. It redeems. It transforms. It gives second chances to people who don't deserve them, because sometimes that's when they need them most. Rebecca stepped forward, her practical nature showing through even in this moment of emotional revelation. We've learned something in these 20 years that you haven't. Running away from pain doesn't end it, it just spreads it around. We want to help you stop running, and we want to help ourselves heal the last pieces of what you broke, Victoria added with characteristic honesty. Helping you become better will help us become better too. Sam nodded slowly, understanding finally beginning to dawn. This wasn't about romantic love or marriage or the dreams he'd shattered. This was about something bigger. About the power of human connection to heal even the deepest wounds, about the possibility of redemption even for those who'd run from it for 20 years. I'll need to fill in the grave, he said, looking down at the hole he'd dug for himself. We'll help you, Catherine said, her voice carrying the determination that had made her a successful rancher. We'll help you bury the past and plant something new. Chapter 4, The Ritual of Renewal. Together, the 11 of them worked in the growing light of dawn, shoveling mud and rain-soaked earth back into the grave that would now hold only regret, not a life. As they worked, they talked, really talked, for the first time in 20 years. I married William Patterson 3 years after you left, Margaret said, her shovel cutting through the clay with efficient strokes. Good man, kind. He knew about you, about what happened. He said he was grateful because if you hadn't run, he never would have found me. I married too, Catherine said, pausing to wipe rain from her face. James Miller. He helped me expand the ranch. Never once tried to tell me how to run it. We've got 3 children now. One by one, they shared their stories. Elizabeth had married a traveling merchant and moved to San Antonio, where she'd opened a restaurant that served the best food in the city. Sarah had indeed taken over her father's horse ranch and turned it into the most successful breeding operation in Texas. Mary had married a fellow Irish immigrant and raised 6 children who all spoke with accents that made the neighbors smile. Rebecca had inherited the general store and expanded it into a chain that served 5 counties. Anna had become the head of the county school system, revolutionizing education for children throughout the region. Helen had married a circuit preacher and spent her life bringing comfort to frontier families. Victoria had built her ranch into an empire that employed dozens of families. And Grace, little Grace who'd been so young when Sam had broken her heart, had become a doctor, one of the first women to practice medicine in Texas, serving families who couldn't afford to travel to the big cities for care. You all did so well, Sam said, genuine admiration in his voice. You all became more than I ever imagined possible. We had to, Helen said simply. When you left, we realized we couldn't wait for someone else to make our dreams come true. We had to make them ourselves. And we discovered we were stronger than we ever knew," Victoria added. "Your betrayal was terrible, but it taught us that we could survive anything." As they worked filling in the grave, Sam began to understand something he'd never grasped before. His betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been transformative. These women had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to them and used it as fuel to build extraordinary lives. "I should have been there," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have been part of your successes, your joys, your triumphs." "Maybe," Sarah said, her practical nature showing through, "but maybe not. Maybe we needed to become who we were meant to be on our own first. Maybe you needed to become who you were meant to be too," Elizabeth added gently. "Maybe this 20 years of suffering was necessary for you to learn what really matters." The grave was nearly filled now, and the rain was beginning to slow. In the distance, Sam could see the first hint of real dawn breaking through the clouds, painting the sky in shades of hope he'd forgotten existed. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked. "How do I make amends for 20 years of cowardice?" "You start by living," Margaret said, patting down the last shovelful of earth. "You start by serving others instead of serving your own guilt. You start by being the man you were meant to be," Catherine added, leaning on her shovel. "Not the man you thought you should be, but the man you actually are." Anna, with her teacher's wisdom, looked at him seriously. "The children at the school need someone who understands what it's like to make terrible mistakes. Someone who can teach them that failure isn't the end of the story." "The families I serve need someone who understands suffering," Helen said. "Someone who can offer comfort because he's been where they are." "The workers on my ranch need someone who understands the value of hard work," Victoria said. "Someone who knows what it's like to start over from nothing." "The patients I treat need someone who understands what it's like to be broken," Grace added. "Someone who can help them heal because he's learning to heal himself." Sam looked around at these remarkable women, seeing them clearly for the first time. They weren't the young brides he'd abandoned. They were something far more powerful. They were women who'd taken the worst thing that had ever happened to them and transformed it into strength, wisdom, and purpose. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, your friendship, your help. None of us deserve the good things that come to us," Mary said, her Irish accent making the words sound like a blessing. "But we accept them anyway, because that's what grace is. Unearned gifts that make us better than we were, and we give them to others," Rebecca added, "because that's what love is, passing on the gifts we've been given." The sun was fully up now, and the rain had stopped entirely. The storm was over, and in its wake, everything looked washed clean and new. Sam stood in the middle of the circle of women, no longer the broken man who'd been digging his own grave a few hours ago. "I'll try," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "I'll try to be the man you believe I can be. That's all any of us can do," Margaret said, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "Try, and keep trying, and accept help when we need it. And remember," Catherine added, "you're not alone anymore. You've got 10 sisters now, whether you like it or not." Sam laughed, actually laughed for the first time in 20 years. "I like it," he said. "I like it very much." Chapter 5, The Dawn of Redemption. As they walked back toward town together, Sam realized that the story he'd been telling himself for 20 years was wrong. He'd thought he was a coward who'd run from love, but these women had shown him something different. He'd been a broken man who'd needed to learn how to be whole, and sometimes that learning required darkness before it could reach light. "What will people say?" he asked as they approached the outskirts of town, where early morning smoke was already rising from chimneys. "They'll say a lot of things," Victoria said with a laugh, "but they'll also see 10 successful women who've chosen to forgive and help someone who hurt them. That's a powerful message. And they'll see a man who's finally ready to face his mistakes," Anna added. "That's equally powerful. The important thing," Helen said with her preacher's daughter wisdom, "is that you're not the same man who ran away 20 years ago. You've suffered, You've learned, you've been broken and rebuilt. That makes you more valuable, not less. Sam nodded, understanding something fundamental that had eluded him for decades. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about transforming it into something useful, something that could help others avoid the same mistakes or find their way back from similar darkness. I'll need a place to stay, he said practically, somewhere to work from. There's a cabin on my ranch, Victoria said. It's small, but it's yours if you want it. In exchange, you can help with the horses and the ranch work. The school has a small apartment for teachers, Anna added. You could use it while you're helping with the children. Or you could stay with James and me, Catherine offered. We've got plenty of room and the children would love to have an uncle around. Sam felt overwhelmed by their generosity, by the way they'd not only forgiven him, but were actively working to help him rebuild his life. I don't know what I did to deserve this, he said. You didn't do anything to deserve it, Grace said gently. That's what makes it grace. None of us deserves forgiveness, but we give it anyway because that's what love does. And because, Margaret added with a smile, we've learned that helping others heal helps us heal too. We're not just doing this for you, Samuel. We're doing it for ourselves. We're doing it for everyone who's ever made a terrible mistake and thought it was the end of their story, Mary said, her Irish accent lending music to the words. We're doing it because someone needs to prove that redemption is possible, Rebecca said practically, even for the worst mistakes. We're doing it because love is stronger than betrayal, Sarah added, her horse trainer's wisdom shining through, and because forgiveness is stronger than revenge. As they entered the town, Sam saw familiar faces beginning to emerge from houses and shops. Some stared in shock, some whispered to their neighbors, some simply watched with curious eyes. But nobody seemed hostile, and Sam realized that his story, their story, was already becoming something larger than the sum of its parts. This is going to be hard, he said, looking around at the town that had once been his home. Yes, Elizabeth said simply. But hard doesn't mean impossible, and you won't be doing it alone. We'll be here, Helen promised. All of us, every step of the way. And when you stumble, Victoria added with a grin, we'll be here to pick you up and dust you off. And when you succeed, Grace said, we'll be here to celebrate with you. And when you're ready to help someone else who's made terrible mistakes, Anna said, we'll be here to help you do that too. Sam looked around at these 10 remarkable women who'd transformed his greatest failure into his greatest opportunity for redemption. They weren't the young brides he'd abandoned. They were something far more powerful. They were living proof that love could survive betrayal, that forgiveness could transform suffering, and that redemption was possible even for those who'd run from it for 20 years. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for saving me from myself. Thank you for giving us the chance to prove that love really can conquer all, Margaret replied, even when it takes 20 years to do it. As they walked through the town toward whatever future awaited them, Sam realized that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about finding the perfect person to marry. Sometimes they're about finding the courage to become the person you were meant to be. With the help of people who love you enough to see you through the darkness and into the light. Behind them, the sun climbed higher in the clear sky, and the earth where Sam had almost dug his grave began to steam in the morning warmth. By evening, wildflowers would start to push through the soil, and by spring that spot would be covered in blooms. Not a monument to death, but a testament to the power of love to bring life from the darkest places. The story of Samuel Hartwell and his 10 brides was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, and this time it would be a story of redemption, service, and the kind of love that transforms not just individuals, but entire communities. Because sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones where everyone gets a second chance, where forgiveness triumphs over revenge, and where broken people help each other become whole again. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to change the world. As the church bells rang the hour, calling the faithful to morning prayer, Sam walked forward into his new life, surrounded by the 10 women who'd taught him that love isn't about possession or choice. It's about sacrifice, service, and the courage to keep loving even when love seems impossible. The rain had stopped, the sun was shining, and redemption was just beginning. The end.